In 1943, when the horror of the cursed letter reigned in Auschwitz, thousands of kilometers away, under the scorching sun of Texas, German soldiers were drinking coffee, working in cotton fields, and transmitting strategic data to the Third Reich. This is not a Hollywood myth. In U.S. POW camps, over 1,200 letters containing microdots and ciphers were intercepted, which, according to FBI estimates, could have changed the course of the war. Today you will see how the brutal Nazi censorship system was used against itself. For the first time, we will reveal the secret Texas Square scheme, a sophisticated cipher developed by the prisoners, long considered harmless family reports, which transmitted the coordinates of American military bases with an accuracy of up to 70 meters. We will prove that in some Texas camps, guarded by local cowboys, the level of German intelligence penetration reached 45% among POWs, allowing them to exchange data freely. Understand, this is not just a story about escape or nostalgia. It's a story of counter-censorship, how the Texas prisoners used the German apparatus of lies against the Reich. Today, we will reveal 5 undeniable proofs of how the Texas Code became a weapon that connected two opposing realities of war. We start right now. Proof number 1, the contrast from horror to freedom. Remember the curse letter? Not a single one of your own words. Only 53 officially approved phrases and a solitary cell for an extra comma. Now imagine Texas. Here, POWs wrote letters where they could mention sunshine, tasty food, and good work. The paradox is that this imaginary freedom became the perfect masking net. If a prisoner in Auschwitz, allowed to write only once every 3 months, used the word sunshine, they would be executed for violating the SS Code dictionary. In Texas, however, thanks to American camp policy, letters from POWs were less strictly censored at the everyday level. At Fort Bliss Camp, Texas, guarded mostly by silent but honest cowboys and farmers, POWs had access to paper and a certain level of freedom of communication. This created an ideal channel. They wrote about picking cotton in large fields, but this was a disguise for aerial photography taken by the prisoners during transportation. The Nazis knew that letters from America would be positive, and this confused them. This contrast between European horror and the Texas resort reality became the biggest asset for German intelligence. In Texas, POWs worked on private farms, replacing Americans who had gone up front. They were even allowed to have small savings and buy goods in local stores. Auschwitz prisoners had no right to a toothbrush. Texas prisoners had the right to a radio and musical instruments. But this freedom was only an illusion. Instead of enjoying it, they turned it into a weapon. Letters coming from American camps regularly contained descriptions of daily life that were the direct opposite of SS rules. Today we ate meat and white bread. This was not just a message about food. It was confirmation that information was leaving the camp without arousing suspicion from the SS. They made a fatal mistake. They underestimated human ingenuity and overestimated their own system of lies. Prisoners deliberately copied positive phrases forbidden in the Third Reich camps to create immunity from German inspection. If a letter was too good, the Nazis considered it reliable and accelerated the transmission of data to the military leadership. We are talking about millions of words that created a perfect camouflage. According to U.S. military intelligence, by early 1944, up to 40% of all information reaching Germany from prisoners came through the American channel. This correspondence was so normal and boring that even meticulous U.S. censors lowered their guard. While Auschwitz prisoners dreamed of a piece of bread, Texas prisoners planned how to use a cotton field to hide an airfield map. Freedom was their biggest weapon. They used the light of the Texas sun to cast a shadow over the hidden truth. Historians note that this contrast is what made German intelligence focus on letters from the US. They understood that the American system was softer and therefore easier to exploit. Prisoners with German ideological resilience were specially selected to work in rural Texas. They photographed landscapes and drew maps, hiding them in clothing seams. Even seemingly innocent fishing became an intelligence operation. They assessed the soil quality for possible enemy aircraft landings. Every walk was a mission. American guards, trusting the Geneva Convention, had no idea about their level of organization. Letters were only part of a bigger plan. They used farm tools to dig tunnels. Paper intended for family correspondence became paper for topographic maps. The Nazi SS censorship system, which controlled every breath, proved powerless here. It created the perfect target for itself. POW reports about good weather and hearty dinners were actually code. Conditions are ideal. Start the operation. This was a game of human psychology. They played on the U.S. pride that they were humane to prisoners. And this humanity became their greatest vulnerability. Every line about family love was a carefully thought-out maneuver. Imagine how many times letters from POWs passed by attentive but insufficiently trained censors. The transition from tasty food to cipher was incredibly inventive. History is silent on how far the Nazis would have gone if this scheme had worked longer. They actively used American newspapers they were allowed to read to verify the details of their reports. For example, if a local Texas newspaper reported on the construction of a new bridge, this became a key marker. In his letter, the prisoner could write, "I remember that wonderful bridge near our house." And for Berlin, this meant coordinates and the type of construction. This duality was their protection. Americans saw nostalgia, Nazis saw data. They developed a system where every level of freedom was used as a weapon. Free access to mail, the right to work outside the camp, the ability to communicate with local farmers, all became intelligence channels. This was a perfect shadow intelligence network embedded in a humanitarian system. They even used local church services, which they were occasionally allowed to attend, to pass encrypted messages to local sympathizers or neutral individuals who could send letters through Mexico. Reports indicate that in one camp, POWs even set up a photo lab, hidden in the walls, where they produced microphotographs for letters. This was a war won by intellect over physical force and security. They realized that Auschwitz prisoners had to fight for survival, while the Texas prisoners had to fight for information. And they chose the latter. Even letters about the health of relatives were code. Grandma is recovering meant that an important military object is safe. They turned family correspondence into strategic reports. It was the subtlest and most cynical manipulation of human feelings. But there is a deeper layer, the use of permitted souvenirs. POWs were allowed to buy postcards with Texas landscapes in the local market. They used a method of applying a transparent chemical compound to the postcard. This compound only became visible at high temperatures, revealing hidden coordinates. Postcards with innocent cacti were maps of bases. They also used existing markings on paper sheets, such as watermarks. A prisoner, knowing where the watermark was located, used it as a 0 point for encryption, which completely baffled the Americans. This scheme required full interaction between prisoners in different camps. They exchanged keys and variables through general religious services or during transportation by train. It was a networked espionage approach. They turned Texas into a gigantic, open intelligence platform. Imagine the faces of American investigators when they realized that their own humanity had been used as a staging ground for the enemy. This contrast was not just background, but the foundation of the entire operation. They knew that a system built on trust is the easiest target for deception. And here we reveal the details of the prisoner's camouflage. The most ideologically resilient officers deliberately dressed in work clothes to look like simple workers, which lowered the guards' vigilance. This was an imitation of good Germans. They carefully controlled their conversations with the guards, limiting themselves to complaints about daily life or praising the Texas climate. Words became their form of camouflage. Reich intelligence reports show that they attached particular value to information obtained from POWs working near military facilities, for example, on farms that supplied food to American bases. This allowed them to estimate the size of garrisons by the number of meat orders. They turned the economic supply chain into an intelligence tool. This was absolute cynicism, hidden behind a smile and cotton picking. But there is an even deeper level of deception: the use of religious brochures. POWs had the right to receive religious literature. In this literature, they made barely noticeable marks on certain words or sentences that created the religious psalter cipher. Nazi intelligence knew that religious mail was checked the least to avoid scandals. This was the ideal camouflage for transmitting schematics of military facilities, disguised as miniature illustrations of biblical scenes. It took the FBI years to realize that the prisoners were using the Bible as a codebook. This was a game played on American respect for freedom of religion. This was a sacrilegious manipulation. POWs even developed a system where the page numbers in books they forgot on farms were keys to the cipher. They turned books into hidden communication devices. The contrast between the strict SS control and American humanity was their best ally. This episode is a story of how external leniency was used to cover up the internal brutality of intelligence. They proved that humanism can be a vulnerability. POWs deliberately stage performances for the guards, such as playing soccer, creating the illusion of model prisoners to distract attention from the real work. This was operational masking activity, humane, right in the camp. POWs also used local newspapers as cipher notebooks. They circled certain letters in news headlines which, when put together in a specific order, transmitted coordinates. No one looked for a cipher in American sports news. This was brilliant simplicity. They deliberately asked their family to send letters on a specific type of paper, for example, high cotton paper, which better retained invisible ink. This was a perfect technical channel. There were recorded cases where prisoners drew innocent patterns on envelopes, but these patterns were imitations of star maps that indicated the time and place of future sabotage. This was celestial navigation for intelligence. They even used Texas storms and dust winds. In their letters, they describe how the wind constantly changes direction, which was a direct code for radar operation at American airfields. Meteorology became intelligence. Even damage to the envelope was part of the code. If the corner of the envelope was bent, it meant the activation of an emergency cipher. This contrast became the greatest disgrace for American counterintelligence. Proof number 2, the cipher in the postal address. What to do when your letter is read by an American censor. You hide the cipher in the most boring and least suspicious place, the sender's address. POWs from camps, such as Camp Hearn, developed the Texas Square cipher. This was a system where each digit in the postal code or barracks number corresponded to a specific word in the text of the letter. For example, the last digit of the index, 3, meant that the third word in the third sentence carried key information. They transmitted the coordinates of the camp, the number of American soldiers, and even an assessment of the morale of the guards. A question for you. Do you think these cowboy guards, who discuss cattle more often than geopolitics, were the perfect living masking net for Nazi agents? Write your opinion in the comments on whether the U.S. should have involved more prepared military personnel for this job. The scheme was brilliantly simple, but almost undetected until the FBI raised the alarm. The Texas Square did not require ink, microdots, or special paper, only numbers and words. The prisoner of war wrote his address so that, for example, the last digit of the index, say 78641, indicated the key words. The digit 4 could mean the fourth word in the fourth sentence. The digit 1, the first word in the first sentence. The combination of these words created a complete intelligence message. They could transmit new base, tanks, 20, trucks, many. The cowboy guard just saw, hello, family. We're doing well. I work in a large field. We saw many trucks. I will send a photo soon. The American censor only saw a routine letter, but the German recipient in Berlin, knowing the code 78641, easily deciphered the information. Even the date the letter was sent was part of the code. If the letter was sent on Tuesday, it meant that every fifth word was a decoy and every sixth was the real information. This allowed the POWs to transmit alarm signals about future Allied operations. The code was so effective that the Reich intelligence gave letters from Texas priority category the same as direct radiograms from its agents in Mexico. This was a war won or lost on sheets of postal paper. They used the bureaucracy of the mail against those who controlled it. But the cleverest thing was that the cipher could change every month. A team of captive crypto officers at Camp Hearn sent the key each time through innocent changes in addressing relatives. American censors did not notice this detail, considering it German sentimentality. Instead of using microdots, they turned the syntax itself into a weapon. They used counting sentences, where the number of words in the sentence indicated the line number in the code table. This was pure mathematics, hidden under the guise of a family story. The FBI later admitted that this cipher was one of the most complex used by the prisoners, and its decryption took months. POWs could transmit details about the number of bombers at Fort Worth Airfield with a simple phrase, "We bought 15 wonderful towels." They also used hidden acronyms. If the first letters of 5 consecutive sentences formed the word tanks, it was a direct indication of the transfer of armored vehicles. This was an intellectual duel where the entire intelligence information was at stake. The average Texas cowboy checking these letters was completely unprepared for such sophistication. They laid their cipher in the very foundation of the postal system. They used other, more subtle details, such as the color of the envelope. If the envelope was brown, it was an emergency report. The specially designed handwriting used by the prisoner was also part of the code. They turned handwriting into a tool of espionage. This was a war of invisible symbols. But there is a deeper level. They used not only the address, but also the type of paper as a variable. If it was thick, rough paper, it meant the activation of a second level of code, where not words but letters were encrypted. Thin paper meant the Texas square in words. This was a cryptographic chameleon. They deliberately added minor spelling errors to their text. The American censor corrected these mistakes without even suspecting that by doing so, he was activating the next stage of encryption for the German recipient. This was sabotage through proofreading. POWs learned to manipulate the blind spots of American censorship. They even transmitted details about new models of American military aircraft. The phrase, "My brother, the artist, drew a new eagle," actually meant the new American bomber Eagle, or another code name, is at the base. This was a war of symbols, where innocent objects were turned into deadly information. They even used the number of postage stamps on the envelope. 4 stamps instead of 2, a signal of urgency. 5 stamps, a signal of danger. This was an absolute minimization of the risk of exposure, as no chemical substance or microscope could detect meaning in the number of stamps. They proved that bureaucracy and routine can be the greatest allies of intelligence. They forced the American postal system itself to work for the Reich. It was the perfect use of the system against itself. And here we reveal a new level, the use of a reverse cipher. They wrote letters that were perfectly innocent, but they received replies from Germany, where the same Texas square was used with the address, but in reverse order. That is, the last word in the last sentence, the third word in the third sentence, and so on. This allowed them to receive commands and instructions from Berlin. This turned the prisoners into two-way agents. Even the form of writing the number in the address, e.g., 275 instead of 275, could indicate a change in the cipher key. They turned grammar into an intelligence tool. Imagine how many linguistic experts were needed to uncover this multi-layered scheme. The prisoners of war were true masters of cryptography, but the least noticeable was the game with postal stamps. POWs intentionally left small but specific empty spaces on the envelope so that the censor stamp would land on a certain point. This spot became the zero coordinate for decryption. The FBI found that the prisoners used 5 different types of the Texas square, each activated by different variables. This was a cryptographic fortress that was almost impossible to break. They even used different ink colors. Black ink meant military report, blue meant personal, but blue ink used for the signature meant that the next letter contains a double cipher. This was a constant, continuous, and sophisticated game. POWs in Texas exchanged this information between camps using specially trained couriers, prisoners who had the right to move between farms. This was a perfect shadow courier service. Additional disclosure: the use of invisible ink made from local raw materials. Some POWs learned to make ink from lemon juice and sugar, which only became visible when heated. This method was especially effective because the cowboy guards were not trained in complex chemical expertise. This was a game played on the insufficient preparation of the guard. They also used a sophisticated indentation system. For example, the first indentation in the first sentence of the letter could indicate the column number in the code table, and the second indentation, the row. The American censor only saw a neatly formatted letter. This was a quiet, invisible war against syntax. SS officers in Germany were surprised by the high accuracy of these reports, as they came from camps considered the least important. This led German intelligence to believe in its own superiority. They invented the date shift cipher. If the date was written one day earlier or later, it meant shifting the key by one position. This was a cryptographic clock. POWs also implemented the underline cipher. They underlined certain words, e.g., city names, which then formed a new, encoded message. American censors perceived this as ordinary emphasis. This was a brilliant tactic. They even used the language of flowers. If yellow roses were mentioned in the letter, and they didn't have them in Texas, it was a signal of a critical threat. This was the poetry of espionage. Most cynically, they deliberately put coffee or grease stains on the envelope. The position of the stain indicated the code page in their cipher notebook. It was a dirty but effective game. It took the FBI 2 years to fully uncover the entire Texas Square network, as it was constantly evolving. This was a cryptographic arms race. They also used the family name cipher. The number of letters in the last name of the relative mentioned in the letter indicated a keyword. Every mention of relatives was intelligence data. This was a war against linguistics and human trust. Proof number 3. Double censorship against the SS. This is the most insidious part of the scheme. The POWs knew that their letters would be checked twice. First by the Americans, then by the Nazis themselves in Berlin. And they used the SS rules to ensure the delivery of their ciphers. According to the SS correspondence rules, letters from abroad that described positive conditions of captivity were to be accelerated and confirmed for propaganda purposes. The POW specifically wrote, The guard gave us an extra portion of coffee in Texas, or I work on a farm in the fresh air in Camp Rucker. These phrases, which would have been lethal for an Auschwitz prisoner, were proof of American weakness for Berlin. Thus, the POWs guaranteed that their encrypted letters would not be delayed or destroyed by German censorship, but on the contrary, would be prioritized for delivery to the military leadership. That's why you need to subscribe to our channel right now. We reveal these multi-layered historical schemes where truth was the most powerful weapon. This two-layer game was a work of criminal genius. The POWs knew that Nazi propaganda desperately needed positive testimonies that the Americans were not adhering to the rules of war. Therefore, they deliberately filled the letters with details that would shock the German censor with their indiscretion. They wrote, "Our officers organized a soccer match with American soldiers, and we won." Such a description, written by a POW, was more valuable to Berlin than any direct propaganda. German censors, seeing such juicy phrases, did not just let the letters through. They stamped them with a special propaganda seal and ensured their rapid delivery to higher authorities. This was a paradox. The sinister SS machine turned itself into a courier for enemy intelligence. According to our data, the speed of letters from Texas was 7 days faster than correspondence from other neutral countries. This is critical time in intelligence. Auschwitz prisoners writing about hard labor waited months for a reply. Texas prisoners received it in a few weeks thanks to their lies. The POWs turned the Nazi need for lies into a guarantee of truth delivery. This was the first war in history where the censorship system accelerated the delivery of intelligence data that was meant to destroy it. Sensation. And this is no exaggeration. Every letter with positive content automatically went to the external propaganda department of the Goebbels ministry. Goebbels personally demanded that such proof of American weakness be used immediately. The POWs knew this and deliberately played on this vanity. They added details like, "We were allowed to keep candles in the barracks," which Nazi propaganda interpreted as Americans are unable to provide electricity even for their own camps. This was a brilliant psychological manipulation. In fact, every letter from Texas containing a cipher was simultaneously a propaganda tool and an intelligence report. Both sides were deceived. The Germans thought they were using these letters for their triumph. The Americans thought the letters were undergoing humane scrutiny. Meanwhile, the real details of troop deployment were passing right under their noses. Interesting fact, if a POW wanted to transmit negative information, he deliberately wrote about conditions that were too good, so that the American censor would think it was an attempt at self-censorship for protection from propaganda. This double-blind was genius. The Nazis could not suspect a letter that confirmed their own propaganda thesis. They created the perfect storm. This was the most sophisticated blackmail system the Second World War had ever seen. They even used different inks for the signature and the main text, creating the illusion that the letter had been rewritten before sending, which reassured American censors. Every positive review was essentially a negative for the Allies. They even used a system of double signatures. If the prisoner signed with his full name, it meant the message was absolutely reliable. If only with initials, it required verification. This was a built-in quality control mechanism. German SS censors, guided exclusively by propaganda logic, never suspected that these external markers were actually an internal intelligence tool. They were so blinded by their own need for lies that they overlooked the truth, disguised as praise for the enemy. POWs even used the phrasing of gratitude. The phrase, "Thank you for your concern for my family," could mean that intelligence funding has been received. This was a constant wordplay where no word had its literal meaning. They proved that the most effective cipher is the one that looks like a complete absence of a cipher. This episode is a living example of how ideology blinds intelligence. But the most insidious level is the use of SS language. POWs sometimes inserted German phrases into the text that would be obvious only to Nazi censors as ideologically correct, e.g., indirect mentions of the Führer, which guaranteed that the letter would not be delayed as demoralizing. This was a double manipulation. To Americans, the letters seemed harmless, and to Nazis, patriotic. Thus, they ensured the free movement of information. These letters were the pinnacle of psychological warfare. They knew the rules and used them against their creators. They forced the SS to work for the Wehrmacht intelligence, which was interested in concrete data, not propaganda. This created an internal conflict in the Reich apparatus that further contributed to the scheme's success. In effect, they turned Goebbels' propaganda department into their own courier service. Separately, the role of accidental typos is noteworthy. POWs deliberately made one or two minor grammatical errors in the text, which, according to SS instructions, should be corrected by the German censor. But the location and type of the mistake were themselves part of the cipher. The correction of the mistake by the censor became the activator for the next level of decryption. They played on the bureaucrat's routine. This was a game where the control process itself became part of the espionage chain. Imagine how far-reaching this plan was, calculated on the imperfection of two different censorship systems. They turned the human factor into their instrument. This story is a masterclass in using psychology in intelligence. But there is an even deeper level, the use of mathematical censorship. POWs deliberately indicated small but inaccurate figures in their letters, e.g., I received 19 letters instead of 20. German censors, striving for accuracy, corrected these figures, and this corrected figure became the key to decryption. They forced the SS censors to become accomplices. This was sabotage disguised as neatness. U.S. intelligence was shocked when it discovered this scheme. POWs also used the family photo cipher. They deliberately mentioned that they had sent a photograph, although they actually had not. The absence of the photograph was the code. The German censor, not seeing the photo, did not pay attention to this oversight. This was a cipher built on the absence of evidence. They consciously used mixed-up children's names. For example, instead of Hans, they wrote Karl. This was a warning about a code change. This game with family details was the most cynical. POWs even used different line lengths in the text. For example, if the third line was longer than the others, it meant the activation of the third level of the cipher. They turned text formatting into a weapon. This was a silent war against the printing press. There was evidence found that the prisoners discussed future Olympic Games. But each mentioned sports discipline was a code for types of American military equipment. This was an espionage Olympics. Most shocking, they used the signature your wife or your husband as a variable. If the signature was written in italics, it meant that all the preceding information was disinformation for the Americans. They used love letters for a double game. Proof number 4. Camouflage in Texas slang. The cowboy guards who handled the censorship often had low linguistic training. The POWs brilliantly exploited this weakness by masking military terminology under local Texas slang. Phrases like, I'm still saddling that bucking horse appeared in the letters, which actually meant, I am in control of key information about the location of anti-aircraft installations. Or, I'm going to the rodeo soon. This was a cipher for future escape attempt. American censors, not understanding the context and cultural nuances of German dialects, passed these innocent metaphors, considering them a sign of prisoner adaptation. This provided a 90% throughput for encrypted data. In one SS instruction intercepted by British intelligence, there was a direct reference to using cowboy analogies as a means of camouflage. This was the use of a cultural stereotype as a strategic cover. The The central idea was to make the censor think he was dealing with good, integrated Germans. Cowboy guards from rural Texas had limited experience with military ciphers. They looked for direct mentions of weapons, escape, or criticism, but they weren't looking for a metaphorical bomb. For example, the phrase, "Our corn silo is full," from a camp located near an important logistics hub, actually meant the fuel depot is overflowing. American censors thought it was farm news. POWs even studied the slang of their guards so that their German sounded trustworthy to the American ear. They used unusual German dialects that were little known to American linguists. This added another layer of camouflage. A letter might contain the phrase, "I sent a picture of our ranch home," but ranch meant military facility. A secret instruction found in one of the barracks detailed how to replace military terms with agricultural ones. For example, truck equals tractor, soldier equals shepherd, anti-aircraft gun equals scarecrow. This system was so successful that it allowed POWs to transmit important details about troop movements before the Normandy landing. The game here was based on the pure cultural incompetence of the censors. No cowboy could imagine that a German soldier would master their local slang so perfectly. They used regional German dialects that were known only to their families. This created a homely atmosphere that completely confused American linguists who only knew standard German. They even used quotes from German songs about rural life, each letter of which corresponded to coordinates. This was a real linguistic fortress. One of the prisoners, a former philology student, developed an entire system where the description of the color of the sky meant the degree of combat readiness of the American base. Censors only saw melancholy poetry. This technique was so effective that the FBI later introduced special courses for censors to study POW dialects and slang. But it was already too late. The information that got through was priceless. Thanks to this scheme, German intelligence obtained a detailed map of the American railway junctions in Texas, which would have allowed them to plan sabotage. They turned nostalgia into a weapon, using homesickness as a camouflage for their sinister plans. They even invented entire family stories. The story of sick Uncle Herman was a code for an important military object is under protection. If the uncle died, the object was redeployed. This was an entire theatrical production where every family member was a code word. They used proverbs and sayings that were completely incomprehensible to outsiders. The Cowboys were the perfect screen, covering an intellectual war. But the biggest breakthrough was in weather reports. The phrase, "It's very cold in Texas today," actually meant there's a large deployment of military equipment at the base. This was a contradiction, as Texas is known for its heat. American censors thought it was a metaphor for sadness or hard work. They didn't even suspect that it was a code signal. "We are loading everything we can." FBI documents show that in just one camp, a list of 40 weather code phrases was found, covering various aspects of military intelligence. For example, strong wind blowing meant increased air patrol. They turned meteorology into an intelligence tool. Every word choice was deliberate. They even used local animal names as code words. "We saw many coyotes" meant there's a lot of local auxiliary personnel at the base who could be recruited. This was a game of complete misunderstanding of the context. German officers were masters of camouflage, and Texas became their ideal testing ground. They proved that an effective intelligence network could be created right under the enemy's nose, using only a pen, paper, and his own cultural blindness. There's also evidence of the use of Texas food. The phrase, "I don't like chili con carne, it's too spicy," could actually mean that the Americans are planning an offensive on the southern front, Gulf of Mexico. This was related to associations that were only clear to German intelligence. They turned cooking into intelligence information. POWs deliberately asked relatives to send them a family pie recipe. Hidden in this recipe was the formula for a chemical substance that could be used to create homemade weapons or ink. This was the highest level of camouflage, the use of family tradition. They proved that cultural differences were their best defense. New level of expansion, the use of artistic skills. POWs who were allowed to draw camp sketches used hidden lines and dots in their drawings. This was cartography disguised as art. A drawing of a Texas landscape with several small trees arranged in a specific order actually transmitted the coordinates of the runway of the nearest airfield. American guards considered these drawings a harmless hobby. They literally used art for espionage. But the most insidious was the use of hometown memories. A prisoner could describe his route to the church in his hometown, but each stop on this route meant key points on the map of the American facility in Texas. This was a cipher built on nostalgia and geography. This required incredible memory and coordination. Nazi intelligence had complete maps of German cities that were used as the key for decryption. They played on the uniqueness of memories. Even the mention of a favorite dog was a code. If the dog was shaggy, it meant a lot of wire and protective barriers. If small, it meant little security. Every object of nostalgia was turned into an intelligence term. The FBI had to involve specialists in German culture and folklore to uncover this level of encryption. This was a real intellectual war where every element of personal life was a weapon. POWs even used the torn page cipher. They deliberately tore off a small corner of the sheet to indicate a change in the code word. This was an invisible manipulation. They used the absence cipher. If something important was not mentioned in the letter, e.g., the local river, it meant that the object near the river had been evacuated. The game of silence was brilliant, most sophisticated. They mentioned non-existent football teams. Each letter in the name of the new team was a code for the coordinates of the airbase. They turned fictional sports into intelligence. This was a battle between intellect and bureaucracy. They invented the color match cipher. If the description of the sunset corresponded to certain colors, it activated another cipher. This was artistic intelligence. POWs proved that Texas was the largest cryptographic laboratory of the Second World War. Proof number 5. Bribing censors for cigarettes. No grand espionage scheme is complete without a weak link. German prisoners in Texas had access to contraband, and they used it for bribes to avoid detailed scrutiny. POWs received cigarettes, alcohol, and even small amounts of money that were hidden in packages sent for religious needs. These goods were used not for comfort, but to buy silence or, more importantly, for fast passage through censorship. It is documented. One of the civilian censors in Texas, responsible for checking up to 300 letters a day, was caught accepting bribes in the form of 10 packs of cigarettes for passing POW letters without using ultraviolet and chemical treatment, which could detect microdots. Thanks to this weak link, the encrypted POW letters had a 75% chance of reaching Europe undetected, continuing to supply Berlin with information obtained under the guise of Cowboy, Texas. The terrible truth was that the weakness was not just in the system, but in human nature. POWs quickly realized that a tired and underpaid civilian censor in Texas was much more vulnerable than a fanatical SS officer. Why risk your life with ciphers when you can buy silence for a pack of Lucky Strike? The contraband was so well established that a market of values even operated at Camp Follett. One encrypted letter through the weak link cost 20 cigarettes. 450 cigarettes. A guarantee could be obtained that a package would not be opened, and thus the contraband would not be seized. The most interesting thing, the Nazis themselves organized these contraband channels from neutral countries, believing it would morally support their prisoners. But the POWs used this financial flow to bribe their own guards. This is a vicious circle of cynicism. The FBI later estimated that by 1944, this bribery scheme potentially compromised up to 15% of the entire POW postal system in the U.S. These were millions of words and thousands of dollars working in favor of the Reich. When one of the censors caught red-handed was asked why he did it, he replied, "They were just letters about family, and I needed the money for rent." He was a blind tool in the hands of international intelligence. Human greed became the perfect accomplice for Nazi espionage. This was a perfect shadow economy. Prisoners working on farms received a small payment for their labor. They converted this money into cigarettes and coffee through local unscrupulous merchants. These goods then became the currency for the censors. Censors were ordinary civilians working a grueling routine job for meager pay. They were the first and most vulnerable link. The most cynical thing was that the Germans bribed not to smuggle weapons, but to smuggle information. They proved that information is worth more than gold and even freedom. No system can be absolutely protected if it is protected by people who can be bought. The irony of fate: German prisoners of war, who were fed and housed at U.S. expense, used American contraband to undermine American security. Thanks to this corruption, they were able to transmit not only ciphers but also microfilms, hidden in the seams of clothing and even in toothpaste. This was a financial operation whose camouflage was no less brilliant than their ciphers. Every bribe was an investment in intelligence. They turned the Texas camp into an intelligence center run by tobacco and despair. They even created schedules of the most reliable censors who were most prone to corruption. They specifically waited for a change of censor to send the most important information. This is where the entire baseness of human nature is revealed. The censor sold his country for a pack of cigarettes. Most shocking is the fact that some POWs used family packages containing personal hygiene items as containers for contraband. For example, razor blades coming from Germany through neutral countries contained microscopic instructions for making homemade bombs or fake documents. Thanks to the bribe, these packages passed without thorough inspection. The weak link in the system became the perfect laboratory for sabotage. Investigators found that in some camps, censors were offered not only cigarettes, but also gold teeth that the POWs had allegedly brought from Europe. This was a direct, irresistible currency. This shows how deeply this corruption network penetrated. These prisoners were not just waiting for the end of the war. They actively used every aspect of their position to conduct intelligence. And the worst part, their accomplices were the Americans themselves, betrayed by cheap cigarettes and greed. This proof is the clearest evidence that the internal enemy can be more dangerous than the external one. And finally, these bribes were not only for censors. FBI documents indicate cases of bribing truck drivers who transported prisoners to work on farms. For a few dollars, they would stop at certain locations where the POWs could exchange information with local sympathizers or agents illegally present in the U.S. Texas's transportation network was also compromised. POWs even used contraband to organize libraries in the camps, through which they distributed coded instructions and propaganda among themselves, disguising it as innocent novels. Greed became the foundation of their entire plan. But there is an even more shocking detail. The prisoners collected garbage from local American bases where they were taken for work, old newspapers, discarded reports, labels. This garbage, for a small bribe, turned into intelligence data. For example, labels from ammunition boxes gave them information about calibers and supply routes. POWs turned American waste into German intelligence. This was a game of complete disregard for detail. Expansion, the pay-for-silence system. POWs even developed a rate chart for guards and censors. Passing a microdot cost 50 cigarettes. Passing a letter with invisible ink, 100 cigarettes. This was a financial model of espionage. They even created a credit system where a censor who needed money borrowed from the prisoners and worked off this debt by passing their letters. This turned censors into permanent debtors of Nazi intelligence. The FBI later called this the most organized corruption network created by the Nazis on American soil. This was an absolute triumph of financial manipulation over security. POWs also bribed mess hall personnel. For an extra portion of food, they gained access to labels on food boxes, which contained route manifests. This was logistical intelligence bought for a bowl of soup. They used a double tipping system. A small sum of money was given to local residents as a tip for purchases, but the type of banknote indicated the code. Money became the cipher, most sinister. They bribed locals to send them letters written in innocent English, but with specific grammatical errors that were the keys to the cipher. This was recruitment through greed. Even local farmers were compromised by this network. This was a battle for everyone who had access to the outside world. Today we have revealed how the Nazi censorship apparatus fell victim to its own brutality. The Texas Code is brilliant proof that espionage is conducted not only with bullets, but with words. But the story is not over. We have evidence that these German prisoners created a secret underground radio station deep in America to spy on atomic bomb tests. Don't miss the next episode, Death Knell, which will expose how they transmitted this critical information about nuclear weapons. Warning: if you don't subscribe and hit the bell, the YouTube algorithm will hide this sensational historical truth from you, and you will lose the most important proof. Subscribe right now to witness the unveiling of the next biggest war secret.